May 28, 1945. 1,400 hours. Camp Ashford, British Zone, northwestern Germany. Captain Edmund Rothwell stood before 247 German female prisoners assembled in the camp's main yard, the official repatriation order clutched in his hand. The 38-year-old British officer had rehearsed this moment for days, anticipating the joy and relief that would greet his announcement. Ladies, effective immediately, all German female auxiliary personnel detained at this facility are free to return to your homes. The war is over. Your imprisonment is ended. You may leave at any time. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. He paused, watching their faces, expecting tears of happiness, perhaps even applause. What he saw instead made him question whether he had spoken clearly. The women's expressions showed not joy, but fear. Silence hung over the assembly for 3 long seconds. Then a voice from the front row, Helga Schneider, a 24-year-old former Luftwaffe communications auxiliary from Hamburg, spoke the words that would echo through dozens of POW camps across occupied Germany in the summer of 1945. Herr Kapitän, with respect, we wish to stay. Please. Do not make us leave. Behind her, 246 voices rose in agreement. Not celebration. Not gratitude for freedom. But desperate pleas to remain prisoners. What Captain Rothwell didn't know, what none of the Allied officers managing the repatriation of millions of German POWs could have fully anticipated, was that for hundreds of thousands of German women, the word liberation had become synonymous with terror. Beyond the wire of Camp Ashford lay a Germany that no longer existed as they had known it, a landscape of destroyed cities, mass starvation, epidemic disease, Soviet occupation, and a population consumed by rage against anyone associated with the defeated Nazi regime. The women weren't refusing freedom. They were choosing survival. And in the spring of 1945, survival meant staying behind the wire, where former enemies provided safety, food, and protection that their own devastated country could no longer offer. To understand why 247 women begged to remain prisoners, one must first understand who they were and how they came to be detained. The prisoners at Camp Ashford represented a cross-section of the Wehrmacht's female auxiliary services, organizations that had mobilized over 500,000 German women into military-adjacent roles by 1945. Oberhelferin and Emma Hartmann, the senior German prisoner at Camp Ashford, had joined the Luftwaffe Auxiliary Service in 1942 as a radar operator. Her personnel file, captured along with her Luftwaffe unit near Osnabrück on April 14, 1945, revealed a typical trajectory: recruited at age 19 from her clerical job in Bremen, 6 weeks of training at a Luftwaffe communications school, assignment to a radar station tracking Allied bomber formations. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Hartmann's written statement, provided to British intelligence on May 15, 1945, described her service: "We were not soldiers. We did not carry weapons or engage in combat. Our role was technical, operating radar equipment, managing communications, maintaining records. We wore uniforms and served under military discipline, but we believed we were serving Germany, not the Nazi Party. When the British forces overran our position, we surrendered immediately. We expected to be treated as prisoners of war, though we did not know what that would mean." The 247 women at Camp Ashford included 89 former Luftwaffe auxiliaries like Hartmann, 73 Kriegsmarine communications personnel, 52 Wehrmacht administrative staff, 21 nurses from military hospitals, and 12 women who had served in various clerical and technical positions. Ages ranged from 18 to 47. Most came from urban areas: Hamburg, Bremen, Hanover, Berlin, cities that by May 1945 existed only as ruins. Lieutenant Margaret Dawson, the senior British female officer assigned to Camp Ashford as liaison and welfare coordinator, conducted detailed interviews with the prisoners upon their arrival. Her report, filed May 20, 1945, contradicted common assumptions, These women are not fanatic Nazis. Many expressed relief at Germany's defeat. They served because service was compulsory for unmarried women after 1943. They operated radios, filed paperwork, nursed wounded soldiers. Many are terrified of what awaits them outside this camp, but they will not specify why. There is a fear here that transcends normal anxiety about returning to war-damaged homes. Camp Ashford had been established in late April 1945 as a temporary detention facility for German military and auxiliary personnel captured in the final weeks of the war. Located on the grounds of a former German military training base, the camp consisted of 12 wooden barracks, a mess hall, medical facility, and administrative buildings surrounded by wire fencing and guard towers. Captain Rothwell had assumed command on May 1 with orders to process and detain prisoners according to Geneva Convention standards pending Allied decisions on repatriation. His background, peacetime solicitor from Kent, commissioned into the Royal Army Service Corps in 1940, had not prepared him for managing 247 German women who viewed imprisonment as preferable to freedom. The camp operated under strict Geneva Convention protocols. Female prisoners were segregated from male POWs detained in adjacent compounds. Conditions, while austere, met international humanitarian standards: barracks with beds and blankets, 3 meals daily totaling 2,000 calories, access to medical care, sanitary facilities, and recreational time. Sergeant Dorothy Mills, a British nurse assigned to the camp medical facility, maintained detailed health records. Her log from May 15 noted, prisoners arriving in generally poor condition, malnutrition, exhaustion, minor injuries. After 2 weeks of regular meals and rest, dramatic improvement. Many gaining weight. No serious disease outbreaks. Prisoners cooperative and grateful for medical attention. Several expressed surprise at quality of care. What surprised British personnel most was the prisoners' behavior. Rather than the sullen hostility expected from defeated enemies, the German women proved cooperative, organized, and eager to maintain order. Hartmann, recognizing the need for internal structure, had organized the prisoners into work details managing barracks cleaning, kitchen assistance, and laundry operations. Lieutenant Dawson's May 25 report noted, the prisoners have established a remarkably efficient self-governance system. Oberhelfern and Hartmann serves as unofficial leader, maintaining discipline and resolving disputes. Prisoners voluntarily assist with camp operations, kitchen work, laundry, medical support. Their cooperation exceeds that of any POW group I've encountered. When asked why, one prisoner stated, "We wish to be useful. We wish to earn our place here." The food situation particularly impressed the prisoners. British rations, while basic, bread, porridge, soup, occasional meat, represented abundance compared to civilian rations in collapsing Germany. Maria Kellner, a 22-year-old former Wehrmacht clerk from Dusseldorf, stated during her intake interview, "I have not eaten this well in 3 years. In the last months before capture, our rations were 900 calories daily, watery soup and black bread. Here, we receive 3 full meals. The British feed us better than we fed ourselves when we were free." The medical care proved equally significant. Camp Ashford's medical facility, staffed by British nurses and a physician, treated conditions ranging from malnutrition to untreated infections to psychological trauma. Sergeant Mills documented 43 cases of severe malnutrition, 17 respiratory infections, 9 cases of frostbite damage from winter exposure, and widespread dental problems from years of poor nutrition. But it was the security that most profoundly shaped the prisoners' perception. The wire fence and guards that defined their captivity also provided protection from a world beyond the camp that had descended into chaos. To understand why the prisoners feared repatriation, Captain Rothwell needed to understand what repatriation meant. On May 22, he received permission to escort 3 prisoners, Hartmann, Kellner, and Schneider, on a supervised visit to Hamburg, ostensibly to assess conditions for repatriation planning. The journey, documented in Rothwell's official report, revealed a Germany that bore little resemblance to the nation these women had left months earlier. The 3-hour drive from Camp Ashford to Hamburg passed through a landscape of systematic destruction. Villages stood abandoned, their populations fled or dead. Cities existed as skeletal ruins, walls without roofs, streets choked with rubble, infrastructure completely destroyed. Hamburg itself defied description. The city of 1.8 million that Schneider had called home no longer existed in any meaningful sense. Allied bombing, particularly the devastating firestorm attacks of July 1943, had reduced 60% of the city to rubble. What remained functioned as a massive refugee camp where 900,000 survivors struggled to exist without adequate food, shelter, or sanitation. Schneider's reaction, recorded in Rothwell's report, was visceral. She stopped walking when we crested the hill overlooking the city. She stared at the ruins for perhaps a full minute without speaking. Then she turned to me and said, "There is nothing left. Where would I go? My family's home is gone. The street is gone. The neighborhood is gone. Hamburg is gone." She wept for the remainder of the visit. The humanitarian crisis transcended physical destruction. Food distribution systems had collapsed. The official ration for German civilians in May 1945 was 1,040 calories daily, starvation level. Actual distribution often fell below 800 calories. Black markets flourished where those with valuables could trade for food. Those without valuables starved. Major Geoffrey Patterson, British military government officer for the Hamburg district, briefed Rothwell on the situation. "We're managing a humanitarian catastrophe. 800,000 civilians in Hamburg alone, most homeless, all hungry. Disease is epidemic, typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis. Medical supplies are non-existent. We're bringing in food aid as fast as ships can deliver, but it's insufficient. Civilian death rate is approximately 400 per week from starvation and disease. And that's before considering the other problems." The other problems Patterson referred to included lawlessness, revenge attacks, and the systematic violence afflicting women specifically. In the power vacuum following Germany's collapse, criminal gangs operated openly. Survivors settled scores against anyone associated with the Nazi regime. And women, particularly young women, faced threats that Patterson would only describe obliquely. "It is not safe for German women to travel alone. Particularly former military personnel. Particularly in areas where displaced persons and former forced laborers are concentrated. We lack the resources to provide protection." Kellner, who had hoped to return to Dusseldorf, learned during the Hamburg visit that Dusseldorf had been 93% destroyed and now lay in ruins with fewer than 100,000 survivors from a pre-war population of 500,000. Her family's apartment no longer existed. She had no way to locate surviving relatives. She possessed no money, no food, no shelter. When the three women returned to Camp Ashford that evening, Rothwell noticed they seemed relieved to pass back through the gates. Hartmann expressed it directly, "Herr Kapitän, you showed us Hamburg so we would understand that we must leave. But now we understand something else. We cannot survive out there. Here, we are fed. We are safe. We have shelter and medical care. Out there, we have nothing. Please, let us stay." Captain Rothwell's May 28 announcement of repatriation authorization followed official protocol. Allied policy emphasized rapid repatriation of POWs to reduce the burden on military resources. The assumption was that prisoners would naturally wish to return home as quickly as possible. Standing before the assembled women at 1,400 hours, Rothwell had expected his announcement to be received as good news. Instead, he encountered silence, then fear, then the collective refusal that would require him to completely reassess his assumptions. After Schneider's initial statement, "We wish to stay," other voices joined. Kellner stepped forward, "Herr Kapitän, I have nowhere to go. Dusseldorf is destroyed. My family is scattered or dead. If you force us to leave, where should we go? What should we do?" Nurse Bridget Werner, 29 years old from Berlin, spoke next. "I served as a surgical nurse in a Wehrmacht field hospital. In Berlin, that service makes me a target. Former patients' families blame medical staff for their loved ones' deaths. Russian occupation authorities arrest anyone associated with military service. Berlin is more dangerous for me than this camp. Hartmann, as the senior prisoner, addressed Rothwell formally, Herr Kapitän, we understand that under law, you cannot keep us imprisoned now that the war has ended. We understand that continued detention costs your government resources. But we are asking, begging, that you permit us to remain voluntarily. We will work for our keep. We will maintain the camp. We will cause no trouble. Please do not force us into a Germany that no longer has room for us. Lieutenant Dawson, observing the scene, later recorded her impressions. I expected the captain to be pleased that prisoners were being cooperative about repatriation. Instead, he looked horrified. He had come prepared to grant freedom. Instead, he was being asked to continue imprisonment. The women weren't being difficult, they were being desperate. The look on their faces was fear. Pure fear. Rothwell temporized, ladies, I understand your concerns. But I must follow orders. Repatriation authorization has been granted. I will request clarification from headquarters regarding voluntary detention, but I cannot promise such arrangements can be made. I encourage you to make preparations for departure. Over the next 48 hours, not one prisoner made preparations to leave. Instead, a petition appeared, signed by all 247 women, formally requesting permission to remain at Camp Ashford as voluntary residents until conditions in Germany improved sufficiently to permit safe repatriation. The petition, drafted in careful English by Hartmann, who had studied English before the war, outlined specific arguments: inability to locate surviving family members, destruction of home communities, lack of resources for survival, safety concerns, and willingness to perform labor in exchange for continued shelter and rations. Rothwell forwarded the petition to headquarters with his own recommendation: request permission to retain current prisoners on voluntary basis pending assessment of repatriation feasibility. Forcing immediate repatriation would send these women into conditions where their survival is uncertain. Humanitarian concerns suggest permitting temporary voluntary detention is the appropriate course. The response from headquarters, received June 2, was bureaucratic and unhelpful. Current policy requires expedited repatriation of all German military and auxiliary personnel. Voluntary detention arrangements not covered by existing protocols. Await further guidance. While Rothwell awaited guidance, Lieutenant Dawson conducted confidential interviews to understand the prisoner's true fears. What she discovered went beyond concerns about food and shelter. The fears were specific, personal, and in many cases, unspoken in group settings. Nurse Werner confided the reality facing women in Berlin. Berlin is under Soviet occupation. Russian soldiers, they are not kind to German women. Especially women who serve the military. My friend wrote to me before communication stopped. She said women do not go outside alone. Ever. There are stories, terrible stories. I would rather die here than face that in Berlin. Schneider described a different threat. In Hamburg, displaced persons and former forced laborers are taking revenge on anyone associated with the Nazi system. They do not distinguish between SS fanatics and radar operators who never hurt anyone. I wore a Luftwaffe uniform. That makes me guilty in their eyes. Last month, 2 former auxiliaries were beaten to death in Hamburg. The British military police found their bodies in an alley. No one was arrested. Kellner's fears were more immediate. I have no money. No ration card. No housing assignment. In Dusseldorf, women like me, homeless, alone, with no resources, they survive by trading themselves. I am not naive. I know what that means. Here, I have dignity. I have safety. Out there, I have nothing, so I would become nothing. Medical records revealed additional context. Sergeant Mill's confidential log noted 12 prisoners being treated for symptoms of sexual trauma. 5 had been assaulted during their military service. 7 had been attacked during the chaotic retreat before capture. All expressed terror at the thought of being outside military protection. Perhaps most telling was a conversation Dawson had with 19-year-old Greta Bachmann, the youngest prisoner. Bachmann had served 6 months as a Luftwaffe communications auxiliary before capture. She came from a small village near Kassel that had been fought over 3 times in the final weeks of the war. "Frau Lieutenant," Bachmann said quietly, "my village no longer exists. The buildings are rubble. The people are gone, fled, dead, I do not know. My parents. I received word through the Red Cross. Both died in February. Typhus. I am alone in the world. If you force me to leave this camp, I will walk out the gate, and then what? Where will I go? What will I do? At least here, I am alive. I would like to remain alive." The pattern was clear. For these women, Camp Ashford represented the only stability and safety they had experienced since Germany's collapse. The wire fence that defined their captivity also protected them from a world that viewed them with suspicion at best and active hostility at worst. While Captain Rothwell awaited guidance from headquarters, reports began arriving from other British and American POW camps across occupied Germany revealing an identical pattern. The situation at Camp Ashford was not an anomaly, it was systemic. On June 5, 1945, Rothwell attended a regional POW administration conference in Hanover. What he heard from other camp commanders confirmed that Camp Ashford's experience was being replicated across dozens of facilities. Major William Thornton, commanding a camp near Bremen holding 340 German female auxiliaries, reported, "I announced repatriation authorization on June 1. Not a single prisoner accepted. They submitted a collective petition requesting permission to remain. Same language as other camps, willingness to work, concerns about safety, nowhere to return to. I thought perhaps my prisoners were uniquely problematic. Now I understand this is universal." Colonel James Hartley, British military government liaison officer, presented statistics that revealed the scope. As of June 4, we have authorized repatriation for approximately 4,200 German female military and auxiliary personnel across 23 camps in the British occupation zone. Actual repatriation rate, less than 8%. Over 3,800 have refused release. American commanders report similar patterns in their zones. This represents a crisis in POW policy. The reasons for refusal, documented across multiple camps, showed remarkable consistency: destroyed home cities, missing or dead families, fear of violence, lack of resources for survival, and recognition that POW camps provided better living conditions than existed outside. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Richardson, senior British female officer for POW administration, had conducted a systematic study of the refusal phenomenon. Her report, presented at the Hanover Conference, provided the first comprehensive analysis. The women refusing repatriation fall into predictable categories. First, those from cities in the Soviet occupation zone, Berlin, Dresden, Leipzig, who fear Russian treatment of former German military personnel. Second, those from completely destroyed cities, Hamburg, Cologne, Bremen, where infrastructure no longer exists to support returning populations. Third, those who have lost all family members and have no support network. Fourth, younger women traveling alone who fear assault. The common thread: they perceive POW camps as safer than freedom in occupied Germany. What surprised Allied officers most was the correlation between camp conditions and refusal rates. Camps with better food, medical care, and security saw higher refusal rates. The better prisoners were treated, the more desperately they wished to stay. While Captain Rothwell awaited guidance from headquarters, reports began arriving from other British and American POW camps across occupied Germany revealing an identical pattern. The situation at Camp Ashford was not an anomaly, it was systemic. On June 5, 1945, Rothwell attended a regional POW administration conference in Hanover. What he heard from other camp commanders confirmed that Camp Ashford's experience was being replicated across dozens of facilities. Major William Thornton, commanding a camp near Bremen holding 340 German female auxiliaries, reported, "I announced repatriation authorization on June 1. Not a single prisoner accepted. They submitted a collective petition requesting permission to remain. Same language as other camps, willingness to work, concerns about safety, nowhere to return to. I thought perhaps my prisoners were uniquely problematic. Now I understand this is universal. Colonel James Hartley, British military government liaison officer, presented statistics that revealed the scope. As of June 4, we have authorized repatriation for approximately 4,200 German female military and auxiliary personnel across 23 camps in the British occupation zone. Actual repatriation rate, less than 8%. Over 3,800 have refused release. American commanders report similar patterns in their zones. This represents a crisis in POW policy. The reasons for refusal, documented across multiple camps, showed remarkable consistency: destroyed home cities, missing or dead families, fear of violence, lack of resources for survival, and recognition that POW camps provided better living conditions than existed outside. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Richardson, senior British female officer for POW administration, had conducted a systematic study of the refusal phenomenon. Her report, presented at the Hanover Conference, provided the first comprehensive analysis. The women refusing repatriation fall into predictable categories. First, those from cities in the Soviet occupation zone, Berlin, Dresden, Leipzig, who fear Russian treatment of former German military personnel. Second, those from completely destroyed cities, Hamburg, Cologne, Bremen, where infrastructure no longer exists to support returning populations. Third, those who have lost all family members and have no support network. Fourth, younger women traveling alone who fear assault. The common thread: they perceive POW camps as safer than freedom in occupied Germany. What surprised Allied officers most was the correlation between camp conditions and refusal rates. Camps with better food, medical care, and security saw higher refusal rates. The better prisoners were treated, the more desperately they wished to stay. The voluntary detention crisis created an unprecedented policy challenge. Geneva Convention protocols addressed treatment of prisoners during wartime but provided no framework for prisoners who refused repatriation after hostilities ended. Allied policy emphasized rapid repatriation to reduce occupation costs and administrative burden. Yet forcing repatriation contradicted humanitarian principles if prisoners faced genuine danger. Brigadier General Thomas Whitmore, British Army Headquarters staff officer responsible for POW policy, articulated the dilemma in a June 8 memorandum: "We face a contradiction between policy and reality. Policy requires rapid repatriation. Reality demonstrates that immediate repatriation may endanger prisoners' lives. Forcing women into conditions where their survival is questionable violates humanitarian obligations. Permitting indefinite voluntary detention creates legal complications and resource burdens. We need a third option." The American occupation authorities faced identical challenges. Colonel Robert Henderson, U.S. Army POW administration officer, reported that across American-controlled camps in Bavaria and Hesse, over 60% of German female prisoners had refused repatriation. His June 10 report noted, "We are effectively operating refugee camps disguised as POW facilities. The prisoners work voluntarily, cause no security issues, and explicitly request continued detention. But our authorization is for prisoner detention, not refugee management. The legal status is ambiguous." The resource question proved significant. Each prisoner required food rations, medical care, housing, and guards, costs the occupation authorities wished to minimize. But as Lieutenant Dawson noted in her June 12 report from Camp Ashford, the prisoners now perform virtually all camp maintenance. They cook, clean, do laundry, maintain facilities, and assist medical staff. The actual resource burden is minimal compared to a non-working prisoner population. If anything, they reduce our administrative load. The solution emerged gradually through informal accommodations. Camp commanders, unable to force repatriation and unwilling to abandon prisoners to dangerous conditions, began implementing voluntary worker programs. Prisoners who wished to stay would be reclassified from POW status to displaced persons pending repatriation and assigned productive labor in exchange for continued shelter and rations. On June 18, 1945, British and American occupation authorities jointly announced Policy Directive 47, Interim Measures for German Female Auxiliary Personnel Pending Repatriation. The directive represented a compromise between competing pressures. Key provisions included, first, immediate repatriation remained official policy and would be encouraged. Second, female former military personnel who could demonstrate legitimate concerns about immediate repatriation could apply for temporary retention as displaced persons. Third, those granted temporary retention would be required to perform labor assignments in support of occupation administration. Fourth, retention would be reviewed quarterly with the expectation that conditions would eventually improve sufficiently to permit safe repatriation. At Camp Ashford, Captain Rothwell assembled the prisoners on June 20 to explain the new policy. His announcement was greeted not with enthusiasm but with relief. Oberhelfer and Hartmann, speaking for the group, expressed the collective reaction. Herr Kapitän, we understand this is temporary. We understand we cannot stay forever. But we are grateful for time to let Germany recover before we must face it. We will work hard. We will prove we deserve this opportunity. The implementation transformed camp operations. Rothwell, working with Lieutenant Dawson and Hartmann, organized the prisoners into work details supporting British occupation administration. 53 prisoners with medical training were assigned to assist in German civilian hospitals overwhelmed with patients. 48 with administrative skills worked in British military government offices processing paperwork. 62 with technical backgrounds were employed in communications and logistics operations. The remainder maintained camp operations and supported relief efforts. The work was genuine labor, not busy work. Nurse Bridget Werner, assigned to Hamburg General Hospital, worked 12-hour shifts assisting British medical staff treating German civilians. Her June 28 letter to Rothwell, required to inform him of her status, described the situation. The hospital is overwhelmed. 3,000 patients, capacity for 800. People dying in hallways from diseases that were conquered decades ago. The British medical staff are doing everything possible, but they need help. I am grateful to be useful. I am grateful to have purpose beyond simply surviving. Maria Kelmer, assigned to a British military government office in Oldenburg, processed housing allocation paperwork for German civilians. Her work involved reviewing applications from families seeking assignment to whatever habitable structures remained. The applications revealed the scope of the crisis: families of 8 people living in single rooms, multiple families sharing destroyed buildings, tens of thousands awaiting any housing at all. The compensation was modest: continued camp housing, 3 meals daily, basic medical care, and a small monthly allowance of occupation currency. But compared to conditions outside camp, it represented security and stability. As summer 1945 turned to autumn and winter, the temporary retention of German female former POWs evolved into a semi-permanent arrangement. Conditions in Germany improved slowly, too slowly to permit safe repatriation for most prisoners. By October 1945, Camp Ashford's population had actually increased. Word spread among German women that the British camps offered safety, food, and work. Desperate women presented themselves at camp gates requesting admission. Rothwell, operating under the Displaced Persons Framework, accepted 43 additional women between July and October, all former military auxiliaries who had initially returned to destroyed homes, discovered survival was impossible, and sought refuge. One such case was Anneliese Bachmann, a 26-year-old former Luftwaffe clerk from Essen. She arrived at Camp Ashford on September 3, emaciated and traumatized. Her statement to Lieutenant Dawson revealed what freedom had meant: I was released from an American camp in May. I returned to Essen. My home was rubble. My family was dead. I had no food, no shelter, no way to survive. For 3 months, I did what I had to do to eat. Then I heard women talking about the British camps, that they take us back if we served in auxiliaries. I walked for 5 days to get here. Please. Let me stay. I will work. I will do anything. Just let me stay where I am safe. The winter of 1945 to 46 proved particularly harsh. In Berlin, Dresden, and other destroyed cities, thousands died from cold, starvation, and disease. In Camp Ashford and similar facilities, the former prisoners survived in relative security. The contrast was not lost on anyone. Greta Bachmann, the 19-year-old who had told Lieutenant Dawson she had nowhere to go, spent the winter working in the camp's expanded administrative section. In a January 1946 letter to her aunt, recently located through Red Cross tracing services, she wrote, "I know you think it is shameful that I remain in a prison camp. But Aunt, if you could see what I see when we go into the cities, people freezing, starving, dying. Here, I am warm. I am fed. I am safe. I am not proud of needing British charity to survive. But I am alive. That is more than many can say." The prisoners' work assignments evolved to meet changing needs. As British occupation authorities recognized the value of German-speaking women familiar with administrative procedures, former prisoners increasingly filled roles in military government, relief operations, and reconstruction planning. By January 1946, over 180 of Camp Ashford's 290 residents, the population having grown with new arrivals, worked off-site in various capacities, returning to camp each evening. The relationship between British personnel and German former prisoners shifted from captors and captives to something more complex. Rothwell's January 15, 1946 report noted, "These women are no longer prisoners in any meaningful sense. They are employees who happen to live in a secured facility. They come and go under supervision, they perform valuable work, they cause no security concerns. The arrangement is mutually beneficial. We obtain skilled labor. They obtain safety and stability until Germany recovers sufficiently to receive them." By 1947, the character of facilities like Camp Ashford had transformed completely. What had been POW camps became displaced person centers, then eventually transitioned to civilian reconstruction worker hostels. The wire came down in March 1947. The guard towers were dismantled. Residents received identity documents and travel permits. The transformation from imprisoned enemies to employed residents was complete. Yet many women chose to remain even after restrictions ended. The hostel, officially redesignated Ashford Reconstruction Workers' Residence in April 1947, continued to provide housing, meals, and work opportunities. For women with nowhere else to go, it remained the best option available. Captain Rothwell, promoted to major and reassigned to other duties in May 1947, reflected on the experience in his final report, "When I arrived in May 1945, I expected to guard enemies until they could be sent home. Instead, I found human beings in desperate circumstances asking for help. Policy said they were prisoners to be repatriated. Reality said they were refugees who needed protection. The women of Camp Ashford taught me that sometimes the greatest service is recognizing when compassion should override regulation. They begged to stay not because they were prisoners, but because we treated them as human beings entitled to basic dignity and safety. That those things required remaining in prison reveals more about the state of Germany than about POW policy." Lieutenant Margaret Dawson, who remained assigned to Ashford through the transition to civilian administration, wrote in her final British Army report, June 1947, "These women made an impossible choice, accept nominal freedom that offered no safety, food, or shelter, or remain captive with German enemies who treated them better than their own defeated country could. They chose survival. History will judge whether we were right to permit that choice, but I know in my conscience we were. Forcing them into starvation and danger would have been the greater crime." The voluntary detention phenomenon influenced Allied occupation policy in unexpected ways. The recognition that immediate forced repatriation could endanger prisoners' welfare led to more nuanced approaches to POW management throughout occupied Germany. By late 1946, official policy had evolved to formally acknowledge that repatriation timing should consider receiving conditions, not just bureaucratic convenience. The revised policy, implemented in October 1946, permitted POWs and detained persons to remain in Allied custody voluntarily if they could demonstrate legitimate safety concerns about repatriation and were willing to perform useful labor. This policy extension covered not just German women but also male POWs from eastern regions facing Soviet occupation, ethnic German refugees from Eastern Europe, and various categories of displaced persons. The principle established by women like those at Camp Ashford, that captivity could be preferable to dangerous freedom, became recognized in occupation administration. The labor contribution proved significant. By 1947, over 300,000 German civilians, including approximately 45,000 former female auxiliary personnel, were employed in various capacities supporting Allied occupation and German reconstruction while living in facilities that had originally been POW camps. They cleared rubble, rebuilt infrastructure, staffed hospitals and schools, provided administrative support, and performed countless tasks that facilitated Germany's recovery. The economic value was substantial. Major General Richard Blackwood, British military government administrator for the Northwestern Zone, noted in a 1948 report, "The voluntary German workers living in former POW facilities represent an unexpected resource. They cost us basic rations and shelter, which we would provide to destitute civilians regardless. In return, they provide skilled and unskilled labor critical to reconstruction. The arrangement is mutually beneficial and has expedited recovery." By 1949, as the Federal Republic of Germany was established and conditions normalized, the last residents of facilities like Ashford began transitioning to independent civilian life. The women who had begged to stay as prisoners in 1945 finally felt able to leave as free citizens in 1949. Of the original 247 women who refused repatriation in May 1945, records indicate that 189 eventually reintegrated into German civilian society between 1946 and 1950. 11 died during the interim period, 7 from disease, 3 in accidents, 1 by suicide. 47 emigrated to other countries, primarily the United States, Canada, and Britain, seeking fresh starts away from war-destroyed Germany. Emma Hartmann remained in British-administered facilities until 1952, longer than almost any other former prisoner. She eventually accepted a civilian administrative position with the British military government and lived in Hanover until her death in 1981. Her personal papers, donated to the Imperial War Museum, included a 1970 reflection, "People ask if I regret begging to stay in prison after the war. I tell them I regret nothing. That choice saved my life. The British treated me with more humanity as a prisoner than my own country could as a citizen. I am grateful for both their mercy and their practical recognition that sometimes protecting the defeated requires unconventional measures." Helga Schneider, who had departed in April 1946, built a successful life in Hamburg. She married in 1949, raised 2 children, and worked as a radar technician for civilian aviation authorities until retirement. In a 1985 interview for a German historical project, she recalled, "When I stood before that British captain in 1945 and said we want to stay, I thought I was begging for my life. Looking back, I was." Hamburg was a death trap that summer. Many who returned immediately did not survive. Those months in Camp Ashford gave Germany time to stabilize just enough that when I finally returned, survival was possible. It was not the freedom anyone would have chosen, but it was life. Bridget Werner remained in British-administered facilities until 1954, working as a nurse in various civilian hospitals. She never returned to Berlin, citing continued concerns about Soviet treatment of anyone associated with former military service. She eventually settled in Munich, where she worked in a Catholic hospital until her retirement. She never married and rarely discussed her wartime experience, but in a brief 1990 interview, she stated simply, "I do not regret my choice. Berlin would have killed me, one way or another. The British gave me the years I needed to outlive the danger." The youngest prisoners faced the longest adjustment. Greta Bachmann left Ashford in 1948 at age 22 with secretarial skills, functional English, saved allowances amounting to 400 occupation marks, and a letter of reference from British authorities. She found employment with an American company in Frankfurt, eventually married an American soldier, and emigrated to the United States in 1951. In a 2005 interview for an oral history project, she reflected, I was 19 when I begged to stay in that camp. I am 79 now. 60 years later, I understand what I could not articulate then. Those years behind wire gave me the foundation to build a life. Without that time to heal, learn, and save, I would have been destroyed by chaos. The British didn't just feed my body, they preserved my future. The story of German female POWs who begged to remain imprisoned became a footnote in post-war history, rarely discussed in the broader narratives of World War II and its aftermath. Yet it illuminated profound truths about the human cost of total war and the complex obligations of victorious powers. Dr. Margaret Thompson's 1994 historical study Voluntary Captivity, German Female POWs and the Post-War Crisis provided the first comprehensive academic analysis. Her research revealed that across British and American occupation zones, approximately 38,000 German women initially refused repatriation when offered in 1945. The refusal rate declined as conditions improved, but over 12,000 women remained in Allied-administered facilities voluntarily through 1947. Thompson's work documented that forced immediate repatriation would have resulted in substantially higher mortality. Statistical analysis comparing health outcomes for women who remained voluntarily detained versus those who returned immediately showed 23% higher survival rates among the former group. The difference was attributed to continued access to adequate nutrition, medical care, and protection from violence during the most dangerous period of post-war chaos. The moral dimension remained debated. Critics argue that Allied authorities should have done more to restore order in occupied Germany so repatriation would be safe, rather than retaining former enemies as workers. Defenders noted that given limited resources and competing priorities, allowing voluntary detention represented a practical humanitarian solution that protected vulnerable women while utilizing their labor for reconstruction. Captain, later Major, Edmund Rothwell never publicly discussed the Camp Ashford experience, but his personal papers, released after his 2001 death, included a 1985 letter to his daughter. "You asked if I am proud of my war service. I participated in no battles. I never fired a shot in anger. But I made one decision I am certain was right. When 247 women begged not to be forced into a dangerous world, I fought to let them stay safe. Military discipline said they were prisoners to be disposed of according to regulation. Human decency said they were people deserving protection. I am proud I chose humanity." The women themselves, in the few instances where they discussed their experiences publicly in later years, consistently expressed gratitude rather than shame. A 1995 reunion of 37 surviving Camp Ashford former residents produced a collective statement: "We begged to remain prisoners because captivity meant survival. Our former enemies treated us as human beings when our own country had become inhumane. We are grateful for the compassion shown by British soldiers who saw past uniforms and recognized simple humanity. Those who judge our choice should ask themselves what they would have done facing starvation, violence, and death. We chose life. We regret nothing." The final irony was noted by multiple historians. Germany's female auxiliaries had served a regime that valued ideology over humanity. When that regime collapsed, they found humanity in the hands of enemies who valued human life over ideology. The wire fence that imprisoned them became the barrier that protected them. Freedom would have killed them. Captivity saved them. From confident expectations of grateful liberation to desperate pleas for continued detention, the story revealed that in the ruins of 1945 Germany, traditional concepts of freedom and imprisonment had inverted. The women who begged "we want to stay" were not refusing freedom, they were choosing the only freedom that mattered, the freedom to survive.